Hello, and welcome to Worldviews. In our last presentation, we showed how most of the people living in the Old Testament held a view that philosophers today call the monistic nature of people. In other words, our bodies, our minds, our consciousness, our feelings, our personalities, our self-awareness, if you will, are all integrated together in one whole, complete package, one complete unit, one holistic being. I know that this may come as a bit of a surprise to some, but in the Old Testament, not much is said of a spirit or a soul that can contain the consciousness of a person, separate from the body at death, or that can survive death of the body, and drift away to some afterlife experience, like so many people believe today. Not just Christians, but Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, and even all of the modern religions of the day. In today's presentation, we are going to take a quick survey of the New Testament to see what the actors in the stories of the New Testament believed. And, on a surface reading, it would seem that almost everyone in the New Testament have become dualists. Now, if you are new to this podcast, you might ask, what is a dualist? Well, when philosophers talk about the nature of people, how we are, made up, they use the word dualist to refer to people who believe that humans are made up of two basic parts. Simply put, they believe that people have a body and a soul, or a spirit force. Most people who hold this understanding of the makeup of people also believe that the soul is the most important part of our makeup, that the body is just, a physical, temporary housing for our souls, and that when the body does die, the soul will live on and migrate to an afterlife experience, or possibly be reborn and enter a new body after, a period of reflection on this life. Some philosophers have promoted the idea that the soul is basically good, but the body, the flesh, is evil, it's bad. And the trouble that we get into when we live out our lives on this earth is because of the housing our souls are required to live in. The soul or the spirit is good, the flesh or the body is bad. You've probably heard the saying, "The devil made me do it." I think it was popularized by Flip Wilson when I was a boy. I remember him coming on with a very comic presentation with that premise. The devil made me do it. Well, this is kind of like that. My body made me do it. My flesh has powerful cravings and passions that are just hard for me to resist. But when I am free from this flesh, I will be better. Have you heard of this teaching? Well, by the time that Jesus arrives on the scene, many of these ideas of Greek philosophy, and that's really where it has originated, had filtered down to the culture of Judea, at least the street culture, the pop culture. We often rarely think about how much the culture of Jesus' day had been impacted by Greek literature, language, philosophy, art, and culture. I think most Christians know already that the New Testament was not written in Hebrew or even the Roman language of the day, but in Greek. In fact, even the Old Testament Bible, when it was read in the synagogues of Jesus' day, was not from the original Hebrew manuscripts, but it was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And that says a lot, I think, about how much the Greek culture had permeated the thinking of the people of Jesus' day. So the question that we want to ask today is, was Jesus, his followers, and later the Apostle Paul, and the believers of Paul's day, were they monistic, like the people of the Old Testament? Or had they begun to follow the philosophy of the Greek philosophers and become dualists? Did Jesus believe and teach that people had immortal souls that contained the consciousness of the person and that it drifted away into the afterlife at death? On a casual reading of the New Testament, it certainly seems that way. There's a lot of talk that seems to refer to such things as souls, spirits, ghosts, reincarnation, and even references to out-of-body experiences. Paul, at one point, even talks about how he would like to die so that he could go and be with the Lord. Jesus tells the thief on the cross, you remember, that by the end of the day, they will be together in paradise. The disciples in the boat, terrified by the storm, become even more fearful that the entity that they see walking on the water must be a ghost. In the New Testament, the idea that sentient beings can exist in an invisible spiritual form are demonstrated through the ministry of angels and the phenomenon of people being possessed and controlled by a demon or an evil spirit. With prayer and fasting, these evil spirits can be cast out, and a person returns to normal. So, how should we as Christians deal with this today? Should we conclude that the people of the Old Testament were just not yet aware of the truth about the real nature and makeup of people, and go with what seems to be the predominant belief in the New Testament? In our journey to make that kind of important decision, I believe the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, are we absolutely sure that the prominent characters of the New Testament were actually dualists? My 10-year-old son likes to question everything. He will often ask, "Are you sure about that?" I think that it would be good if we were a little bit more like my son. Are we sure about this? Could it be that we have been doing too much of a surface reading of the New Testament when we come to some of these conclusions? When it comes to the Bible, most of us are lay people. We read the Bible for devotions and encouragement. Do we really have the tools that we would need to ascertain what the people of the New Testament believed about the nature of people from our devotional reading? I would suggest that this really requires a much deeper analysis than we usually give. Being fluent in biblical Greek, the original language of the New Testament, would be a big first step. But also an intimate understanding of the culture, the worldview, and belief systems of the Greek and Jewish people from that time period would also be very helpful. When Bible scholars with these abilities study the New Testament closely for an answer to our question, when they do this without any bias, what do you think they conclude from their research? It turns out that this is actually a thing. It is called the study of biblical anthropology. And for a good summary of this close study that has recently been done on the New Testament by biblical scholars, to look into the belief systems about the nature and makeup of people as it was commonly believed by the people of Jesus' day, I recommend going to Amazon and searching for a book called Body, Soul, and Life by Joel Green. When Green started doing his research of the recent published works of biblical scholars on this question, he was shocked by the research. As it turns out, a close reading of the New Testament in the original language by scholars who were steeped in the culture and literature of Jesus' day reveals that most of the actors in the gospel story did not believe that people have immortal souls that can retain the consciousness of people when they die. That was just not part of their belief system, their worldview. Surprising? For many, I know it will be. To state that people don't have immortal souls and that the people of the Bible believed this way is kind of like setting off a 9.8 earthquake under the pillars of Christianity. The idea that people have immortal souls is so fixed in Christian doctrine that it is considered by most to be beyond question or investigation. But what if it's wrong? What if we were to discover that most of the highly religious people of Jesus' day, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the learned, the literate, did not believe that people have immortal souls that could exist beyond the death of the body? What if we were to discover that Jesus and his followers, or Paul, or the early Christian church did not believe in the dualistic nature of man? How would that affect our belief system, our worldview? Would we keep on believing in the idea of immortal souls if we discovered that Jesus and the disciples did not? I believe that's an important question that everyone should ask themselves. Whenever I talk about this with a fellow Christian, they will point to the many passages in the New Testament that seem to indicate that the New Testament actors believed in dualism as proof that the New Testament believers must have held this view. And there are 5 or 6 really common stories or passages that are often used to try and prove this. And we'll have to cover these. I think what we'll do is cover each one of these main stories in a separate short presentation. So if this topic is of interest to you and you want to understand what the New Testament actors believed, and I believe for many reasons it should be something that Christians are concerned about and interested in, please stay tuned. If you have not already done so, go ahead and subscribe to this YouTube channel or follow this podcast so that you will be sure to be notified when we release these presentations. But to get your mind thinking about this question, to kind of whet your appetites, let's consider a story from the life of Christ. It is probably the most famous story from the life of Christ that deals with life and death. These days, we hear a lot about NDEs, or near-death experiences. You have probably read about these. With the advancement of today's emergency medical procedures that can resuscitate people who are at the point of death, there have been many reports of people who have had amazing experiences of traveling to a wonderful place of light, peace, and the feeling of intense love, meeting loved ones who have passed away only to be then pulled back to this earth to go on living and share the story of their experience. Well, this story that I want to have us take a look at today from the life of Jesus is a story about a man who returned from death. But it was not an NDE. It was a real death experience. The man was a friend of Jesus by the name of Lazarus. Whenever Jesus would visit Jerusalem, he would often stay in the home of Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha, who lived actually just a few kilometers from the city of Jerusalem in a place called Bethany. The Bible says he loved them all. You can read about this incredible story in the 11th chapter of John. Jesus and his disciples were on travel, preaching the good news of the kingdom in a distant city. And one day, a messenger arrived with a note that said, "Lord, the one whom you love is very sick." The disciples thought for sure that Jesus would quickly say his goodbyes and start making his way to Bethany to visit Lazarus so he could heal him from his illness. But Jesus surprised them by staying on where they were another 2 days. Then Jesus said to them, "We need to go back to Judea. Our friend Lazarus is sleeping." At first, the disciples were relieved. They didn't really understand how Jesus knew these things, but they were glad to hear that Lazarus was sleeping. It was kind of meant that he was, first of all, alive, and that he was probably doing better. His fever had probably broken, and he was now being able to rest comfortably. When Jesus saw that they had misunderstood what he meant, he spoke to them plainly, the Bible says, in clear words that they could understand. Lazarus has died. This is an interesting point to keep in mind. Jesus referred to the state of death as asleep. And this wasn't the first time. You remember the story of the little girl who died when Jesus was on his way to heal her. When he got to the home, the neighbors and friends of the family were gathered around the bed of the little girl, weeping. I have a 12-year-old girl myself. I cannot begin to imagine how devastating it would be to see my little girl lying lifeless on a bed. Jesus tries to calm them by saying, "Don't cry. The girl is only sleeping." Suddenly, the tears and the crying and the weeping turn to laughter. They laugh at Jesus, for there she was, lying on the bed before them, with no breath in her. Jesus takes up her hand and says, "Little girl, rise up." And immediately her breath comes back into her, and she rises up. This story is worth noting, and maybe we'll come back to it in another study. But for today, let's just notice that once again, Jesus refers to the experience of death as an experience similar to sleeping. As Jesus and his disciples approached the home of Lazarus, there was a large group of people gathered to comfort Mary and Martha for the loss of their brother. He had now been dead for 4 days and was already in the tomb. If you visit Bethany today and go on a tour, the tour guide will take you to a tomb carved into the side of a rocky hill, with a rollaway stone to cover the entrance. I have visited this place myself. Of course, there's no way to know for sure that it is the same tomb, but it is kind of nice to think that it is. It is kind of an amazing experience to stand in front of a tomb with a rollaway stone like you have read about for so many years. If you have never gone to the Holy Land and visited some of these biblical sites, I encourage each one of you to put it on your bucket list. It really changes the way you read the Bible once you've visited these places. As Jesus gets close, Martha hears that Jesus is coming, and she goes out to meet him. You can imagine the meeting as she throws herself into the arms of her friend. "Oh, Jesus," she exclaims, "if only you had been here. You could have healed him, and my brother Lazarus would not have died." I can imagine that Jesus held her tenderly for a moment, but then softly said, "Martha, your brother will rise again." And it is the words that Martha chooses to answer Jesus that gives us an amazing window into what the religious Jews of the day believed about death, the state of death, and about how and when people will come back from death into a state of life again. More specifically, it gives us a window into what the followers of Jesus believed about death and the return from death. Let's notice this very carefully. Martha says, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." This was the commonly held belief of the Jews of that time. At least everyone except the Sadducees. Their view of the state of death was quite a bit more grim. But most of the Jews, in spite of the influence of the Greek philosophers, still at this time held the teachings of the Old Testament on this. You go back to the book of Job, you go back to the book of Daniel, and you see that the belief system, the worldview of the Jewish people, was that there is hope for life after death. People who die will live again. They will rise again. But whenever this hope and belief is talked about in the Old Testament, it is always A, through the resurrection of the body, and B, it is always seen as an event that happens at the end of time, on the last day. Why the resurrection of the body? Why is that necessary? It was necessary to the Jewish thinking because in their worldview, life was not possible without a body. Because they were monists, because they were holistic in their thinking, you could not have a life, have a mind, have existence without a body. Why only at the end of time? Well, that is the day when God collects all of the faithful that have lived on this earth to give them their reward. I believe that this is key to understanding what the people of Jesus' day believed on these things. People will live again, but only through the resurrection of the body, and only at the end of time. In future presentations, we'll see this again and again. Well, Mary also comes out and falls at the feet of Jesus, weeping, saying, "O Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died." The Bible says that Jesus was deeply moved and that he also cried. It is a famous verse that even children know about because it has the reputation of being the shortest verse in the Bible. You know the one, Jesus wept. He felt the emotion of the people and cried with them, empathizing with them. Jesus asked the people to roll the stone away from the tomb. Martha protests. She says, "Lord, are you sure you want to do that? He's been dead now for 4 days, and surely he is going to be stinking quite badly by now." Jesus is not dissuaded, and when the stone had been rolled away, he prays to the Father, and as he closes his prayer, he cries out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." There's a rustling inside the tomb, and to everyone's amazement, Lazarus comes out from the tomb. He's struggling a little bit because he has been bound with grave cloths. But he is alive. He that was dead was now alive through the power of God, through Jesus, his Son. This story gives us hope. There is life after death. Our Creator has the power over the sting of the grave. When we lose loved ones in death, it is good to know that the Christ we serve weeps with us, just as he wept with his friends, Mary and Martha. It is good to know that he has the power over death, and that he is the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in him, though he may die, he will live again. The added bonus of this story is that it gives us this window into the worldview of the people of Jesus' day. That even though the Greeks had had their influence on the culture, the primary belief system of the people of Jesus' day, the Jews, the Hebrews, was that people will live again, but only through the resurrection of the body, and only at the end of time. It is, I think, also very interesting to note that there is no record of Lazarus talking about where he had been for the last 4 days. Surely, if he had gone to heaven and started to settle in there, maybe spent some time talking with Abraham, Moses, King David, and enjoying the riches of heaven, that he might have been a little sad to be pulled back down to this earth with all of its pain and suffering. I would think that at the very least there would have been some record of his adventure. This was a very rare thing. It went against what people of the day believed. I would think that his story would have become recorded and become a part of the culture of the early Christian church. Going straight to heaven at death, experiencing life without a body, would have gone so against the worldview of the time that it surely would have immediately become part of the theology of the early Christian church. But we see, or we will see in future studies, that it does not. Why? Perhaps it was because, as Jesus said, he was sleeping. That the state of death, the experience of death, is in many ways like an unconscious sleep. A few years ago, I had a quadruple bypass surgery. I have to say I was a little bit nervous about it going into the operating room. For all intents and purposes, you are dead during the procedure. Your heart is stopped for them to do the amazing work that they do, stitching in a replacement vein, or veins, as the case may be, that they have harvested from other parts of your body. The only reason that your brain cells survive is because during the procedure, your blood is artificially pumped and purified, oxygenated by a bypass machine, an artificial heart and lung machine. It is an amazing technology that has saved now millions of lives, giving people an extra 20 or 30 years of life. That's about 7 years ago now, so I was at the point of death, my doctor says, and so I've now gained 7 years because of that procedure. But with your heart stopped for 4 or 5 hours on a table, you're technically dead. Going into this experience, I wondered, would I might maybe possibly have some kind of NDE, a near-death experience? I thought that this might have been very fascinating, a great story to tell. Here's what actually happened. They put a device over my nose and mouth and asked me to count backwards from 100. I don't think that I even got to 92. That is as far as I remember counting back. And the next thing, I wake up in recovery. And my very first thought was, I guess they decided not to go through with it. Something must have happened with the equipment and they had to cancel the surgery. For me, no time had passed. It had been about 5 hours since they had put me under, but for me, I was still trying to count backwards. No time had passed. For me, my death was like a sleep, just like Jesus had described. My soul did not float away. I did not experience a bright light or see loved ones that had passed on or experience a sense of overpowering peace and love. It was just like I had slept. Now, some Bible students have developed a belief system from this story of Lazarus that Jesus taught the idea that death is kind of a soul sleep. I don't think that is quite correct either. It's not bad, but not quite correct. Remember, the people of Jesus' day are monists. They don't believe that people have souls in the sense of an energy force that can contain our consciousness and memories after death. That was just not part of their belief system. They were aware of the concept because of the Greek influence, but most people, especially the more conservative religious people of the day, did not buy into the Greek idea. So if people did not have souls, how could you have a soul sleep? No, I believe what Jesus is saying here is that death is like a sleep. When people die, they know nothing until that great resurrection morning when Jesus comes back to this earth at the end of time. That, I believe, at its very foundation, is the belief about death in the very first century in Judea. And I think that it is from this context that we must as best we can, understand all of the other passages that are used to try and prove that the people of Jesus' day must have believed in the spirit world, immortal souls, ghosts, and an eternal reward that is entered immediately at the point of death through the convenience of a soul. Please join me next time as we begin to look at some of these passages. If you've enjoyed this presentation, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and follow us on your favorite podcast platforms. So long for today. We'll see you next time here at Worldviews.